Traffic Stop Survival Guide. If you think being polite to an officer means answering all of their questions, you might be setting yourself up for disaster. What you say during a traffic stop can be the difference between going home and going to jail. Let's jump right in. Make no mistake, while a traffic stop is not an arrest, it is a seizure under the United States Constitution and Indiana law, and a person is not free to leave while those disco lights are spinning and flashing behind you and the officer's walking towards the car. So, it's important to know your rights, and this video is going to give a step-by-step guide on surviving traffic stops. Now, I'm a criminal defense lawyer, been a criminal defense lawyer since 2006. I get calls every single day. Marc, they pulled me over for no reason. Hey, Marc, I wasn't really doing anything wrong. The officers don't like me, and I get it. But the reality is, if an officer sees a traffic violation, they're allowed to stop a car. That's the law. And it doesn't matter if they would have let the 5 cars in front of them commit the same traffic violation, but they wanted to single you out. Pretextual stops, unfortunately, in Indiana are okay. And what that means is an officer doesn't like the way you look, officer doesn't like the car you're driving. If he sees a traffic infraction, he's allowed to stop that vehicle. And that's it. Reasonable suspicion is a very low burden. If you want to think about it, you go to jury trial for a criminal charge, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's like the middle of my forehead. That's how much proof. 0 being the ground, middle of my forehead, beyond a reasonable doubt. To take money from somebody in civil court, it's 51%. About my waist. To arrest someone, probable cause. About my kneecap. For reasonable suspicion, to stop somebody, it's very low. It's about between my kneecap and my foot. It's not a lot of suspicion, but that's all they need if they think a traffic infraction has occurred. They can stop you. It's a very low burden of evidence. And the Indiana courts are very forgiving to officers about mistakes. And there's a case out there with the officers like, well, I thought the window tinting was illegal. Turns out it wasn't. But the Indiana Court of Appeals was like, hey, but it's okay for an officer to be mistaken about window tint. It's okay for an officer to be mistaken about perhaps 5 miles an hour over the speed limit versus 25. But they can't be mistaken about an actual infraction. The Court of Appeals is very forgiving with officers. Just understand that it's a high burden to say, hey, the traffic stop was bad. It does happen, but it's a very high burden. Now, the onslaught of body-worn cameras, dash cameras, that's helping keep officers honest. I'm not saying officers weren't honest to begin with, but that type of stuff definitely helps keep them honest. And when that stuff's missing, it kind of raises a red flag. Oh, it was a computer error. There was I couldn't, yeah. So the legality of traffic stops, it's very hard to overturn that. That's why it's even more important to exercise your rights during a traffic stop so the officer doesn't commit any funny business, or even if he's trying to do his job, he doesn't accidentally put funny business on you. That's not what you need in your life. So let's keep going. The Indiana courts, Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, they stress officer safety is paramount. Now, it's not paramount to everything, but officer safety is very important. So do your best to let the courts know if it comes to that. You're trying to make it safe. Pull over as soon as possible. Pull over as far as you can so the officer's not standing in traffic. Now, what happens if you delay pulling over? Well, that's resisting law enforcement by flight. If they have their lights on or they have their audible sirens going on, usually they have both, and a person drives too far, an officer can very easily charge resisting law enforcement by flight, which is a felony, 2.5 years in jail, $10,000 fine. Those charges are very easy. So as soon as you see those lights or hear that siren, you want to pull over in a safe manner. You want to be calm. Officers are taught in the academy approaching a vehicle is one of the most dangerous things they can do in the execution of being an officer. And so officers approaching a vehicle, especially at night, especially in an area that perhaps is not known for its safety, officers are going to be very wary approaching that. You want to be as calm as possible. I was taught by my police officer dad, rest his soul, keep your hands on the wheel so the officer can see them, and you don't want to make any crazy movements in the car. If an officer sees movements in the car, back and forth, that's going to be trouble for the person in the car, because the officer is going to say, I saw furtive movements. And furtive movements is going to give the officer grounds to likely search that car for contraband. So once you're pulled over, you want to be still. You don't want your passengers running around. You want to keep your hands on the wheel. That's number one. Officer comes up to you. I don't know what he's going to say. But if he says license or registration, there's a couple different things going on here. If you say, no, I'm not going to do that, if the officer says, or at least writes down in the report that he saw a traffic violation, by not giving him your identification information, name, address, date of birth, or providing your driver's license, you're committing a crime, refusal to identify. It's a C misdemeanor. They can arrest you, put you in jail. And then we'll talk about that later. If they arrest you, they can do a search of your cars, inventory search incident to arrest. There's so many things going on, so it's a double-edged sword. Whether to give your license, registration, at least identifying information to the officer. I would every single time, because not doing that is going to create problems later on, subject you to a criminal charge. Now, some people will be like, hey, Mark, I don't have to identify myself. That's their job. And you're possibly right. But if they do arrest you and you do not tell the officer who you are, and the court will ask you the same thing, if you don't tell the court, you're not going to get bond. And this is something that I see in practice, and people that are I'm not going to tell you my information. Cool, and you can hang out here until you're in trial. And I have never seen somebody not ultimately give their information, if not to the officer, but to the judge. Because no one wants to be in jail for a traffic violation or a DUI or refuse to identify. You want to lose your job, lose your house, lose your car. So if they ask you for your license registration, give them your license, or at least give them your name, date of birth, your address, so they're not going to charge you the refusal to identify. Now, if you're a passenger in a vehicle, you cannot just get out the car and walk away. I mean, you could try, but if the officer says, sit back in that car, you have to do it. You have to stay in the car. That is law in India. Now, if the officer asks the passenger for their information, now the passenger doesn't have to provide anything unless the officer also believes the passenger committed an infraction. So how can a passenger commit a traffic infraction? Well, it doesn't have to be a traffic infraction. It can be an ordinance violation or infraction. And so the biggest thing I see with passengers is throwing stuff out the window, cigarette butts, trash. If you have passengers in your car, roll their window up and put it on child safety lock. You don't want your passengers causing chaos for you. But that is, I kid you not, passengers are throwing stuff out the window, officers pulling people over and giving you your ID. I'm a passenger, I don't have to give you nothing. Under arrest. It sounds far-fetched, this is happening. So, don't throw things out the window, don't act crazy, passengers. And if you're driving passengers, you can't keep them in control, child lock. Done, problem solved. Now, one other point is, people are always asking me, Mark, how do I know what I've been pulled over for? The officer didn't tell me. And guess what? The officer does not need to tell you at the side of the road what he stopped you for. It'd be a lot better if he did. It'd make a lot more sense, and it could cause people to maybe trust the police more. But the reality is, the officer at the side of the road does not have to tell you why he stopped you. Now, most officers have body-worn cameras. Most police vehicles have cameras in the car. It's going to be apparent why they stopped you later on. But an officer will say things, hey, you know why I stopped you. And they're trying to get people to make statements. Well, I was speeding, I was swerving, I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, playing with my cell phone. Because why they stopped you might be harder to prove than the things you admit why they should have stopped you. And they can always recreate the narrative, hey, I stopped them for this, and X, Y, and Z, the things they admitted to. So that brings us to our next spot. Officers are allowed to ask questions at traffic stops. Hey, do you have any firearms? Do you have any warrants? Do you know why I stopped you? And they can ask questions like that, but you do not need to answer. That's the bottom line. Now, you're going to probably think, oh, Mark, you just told me to give my license and registration. I did, because that's going to create problems if you don't. But beyond that, hey, where are you coming from? Where are you going? Do you have anything in the car I should know about? Do you have any drugs in the car? Do your passengers have any drugs in the car? Anything in the trunk? I plead the fifth. That's it. I plead the fifth. I plead the fifth. Only people that are guilty plead the fifth. I plead the fifth. That's it. You don't got to be a jerk about it, but I plead the fifth. I got pulled over and an officer asked me all sorts of questions, and I plead the fifth. And the officer was smooth. He's like, man, you must have a terrible criminal history if you keep telling me to plead the fifth. You've probably been trained. You must have a horrible history. I looked at him. Nice try. I plead the fifth. He was laughing so hard, he let me go. Now, he could have given me a ticket for speeding because I was speeding. But the reality is, I plead the fifth. You don't have to answer the questions officers ask you at the side of the road. But that doesn't mean they can't ask you questions. Now, sometimes officers will simply ask a person, hey, do you mind if I search the vehicle? Or even if they're real clever, they'll say, hey, if you got nothing to hide, then you won't object to me searching this vehicle, right? So I can search it because you got nothing to hide. And people, my clients that are smart people, if I have nothing to hide, I'll consent to the search. If I consent to the search, that means he knows I have nothing to hide. So these people will be like, oh yeah, you can search the car, knowing that there's things in the vehicle maybe they shouldn't have in the vehicle. Gummies from Michigan, some marijuana from Illinois. Maybe, who knows? But I have smart people doing that. If the officer asks for consent to search, simply say, I plead the fifth. You can say no if you want. I say, I plead the fifth. Now, officers are allowed to search vehicles if you give them permission. If you don't give them permission, they have to ask a judge for a warrant. And that's powerful because an officer doesn't want to bug a judge for no reason. Now, some judges sign anything, but most judges will not do that unless there's probable cause established in the search warrant. But an officer can avoid all of that if you simply consent to the search. So do not consent to the search of your vehicle. Don't let the officer use that Jedi mind trick. If you've nothing to hide, then you'll let me search your vehicle. And don't think you're so clever about, oh, nothing to hide. You're not that clever. He's not that clever either, but just, I plead the fifth. Now, there are some exceptions to the warrant requirement for automobiles. And if you're in a traffic stop, you're in an automobile, right? Now, if the officer has probable cause to believe that there's something in the vehicle illegal, then he can search the vehicle without a warrant. So the things that I see are marijuana, drug paraphernalia, bottle of pills in the cup holder, a firearm sticking between the center console and the driver's seat. But the biggest one is the smell of marijuana. In Indiana, if the officer smells marijuana, raw or burnt marijuana, coming from the vehicle, that vehicle is subject to a search. That's the law in Indiana, and it's supported by the Indiana Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. It does not matter what other states are. In Indiana, that is the law. Smell marijuana, search the car. And that's the automobile exception to the warrant requirement. And people get upset about that. Well, they don't know what I was really smoking, but it doesn't matter because the officer can make a reasonable mistake, and the courts are going to uphold that search so long as that mistake's reasonable. And if officer's saying, well, I smoke marijuana, I can't tell the difference between Delta 8, Delta 9 marijuana or synthetic. I smelled it. So that's the big one we see. But if the officer has any reason to believe that there is a crime occurring, they can search that car under the automobile exception. So the next one too is inventory search subject to an arrest. Now, if officer arrests somebody and the person is driving a car, the officer is allowed to impound that vehicle. Now, they have to have an inventory protocol. The officer has to follow the inventory protocol, but most departments in Indiana have that inventory protocol. And then when they search someone, the inventory protocol says, search the hell out of the vehicle. Maybe not in those words, it's a little bit longer, but they can search it. So if you're getting arrested and your car is being impounded, they're going to search that car and they're going to find things that shouldn't be in there. So be super careful, things you transport in your car, but also the things you allow passengers to transport in your car. Don't let people bring things, I have a bag. Are you okay? Well, you're a shady friend who deals drugs. Oh, yeah, you can bring your stuff. No, you don't want that in your life. So keep that in mind. There's a pretty big exceptions for the automobile, and there's also the weird warrant requirements. Now, length of the traffic stop. Indiana law and the United States Constitution allow an officer to do certain things during a traffic stop. Checking a driver's license, checking for warrants, asking questions about weapons or drugs in vehicles, checking for registration, checking for insurance. So they can make the traffic stop last as long as necessary to get that information, but not longer. And so we see situations where officers draw out a traffic stop and they're trying to draw it out slowly so a drug dog can come on the scene. Now, if the officer stops you and has a drug dog, guess what? That dog can be sniffing your car the entire time the officer's talking with you. But if the drug dog is not at the scene, the officer cannot draw out the traffic stop to allow a drug dog to arrive. It can't be longer than necessary. So this becomes very fact specific. Sometimes when that becomes an issue, you have to find the officer's other traffic stops. Well, you did a traffic stop in 5 minutes the last 10 times. But for my client, it was 25. That's pretty damning. But the Court of Appeals in the Indiana Supreme Court, again, they give a lot of deference to police officers because officer safety. If an officer says, hey, I didn't feel safe asking him questions, waiting for backup. That could be another issue too, for extra long traffic stop. But that's something we're looking for traffic stops. They can't unreasonably prolong a traffic stop. Now, one of the things that I see a lot in my practice is people get very upset with the officers. They start yelling and screaming at traffic stops. They start being real mouthy. They get really upset. And they end up getting arrested for disorderly conduct, making too much noise after being told to stop. They get arrested for refusal to identify. I'm not going to tell you who I am until you tell me why you stopped me. If you feel like you're being wronged by the police, I would try to set something up with Siri, like my phone. Hey, Siri, start recording. And it starts audio recording, but I would record the encounter. If you have a passenger, hey, will you please record? Don't make crazy movements with your hand. You want the officer to be extra mean with you when he comes, but try to record the encounter. A lot of people have dash cams that automatically record that. Try to record the encounter. And then don't be aggressive. Don't be mean on the recording device. So assume he's recording and you're recording. You don't want to seem like a crazy person yelling and screaming. But, even if you feel like you're being in the complete wrong, just talk with the officer. I plead the fifth. Here's my stuff. I do not consent to a search. I plead the fifth. Let him sink his own ship. Let him sink his own ship. You're not going to be able to sink his ship. Officer on the street has a lot of power. As a society, we give them power, and that power is reinforced by the courts, prosecutors, because of officer safety, and rightfully so in lots of cases. But just understand, most of my clients sink their own ship when these officers are acting unreasonable. I want to say jerks, but I would never call an officer a jerk. But they're acting maybe like a jerk. Don't sink your own ship. That's why you have an attorney. If you feel like you were pulled over unjustly, give me a call, 317-632-3642. I would love to talk about what's going on with an officer, what they're doing. If you've been charged with a crime as a result of a traffic stop, give us a call, 317-632-3642. Even if you're in the wrong, we would love to help you and talk to you. And attacking a traffic stop is one of the ways we try to actively fight any and all cases involving automobiles. So, hope you've enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, remember to always plead the fifth.